Hi everyone, my name is Bruce Wilson. I'm a professor of chemistry at Utah Valley University, and I want to tell you the story of alchemy as I understand it. The story starts creation myths back in Egypt. So this is 3000 BC. It is said in one of the four creation myths, they all start the same, there is a flat plane of water and nothing else. No life in the water, no life above the water. A self-existent God creates a pyramid of land, stands on that pyramid, and begins to create the other gods that are involved in the creation of everything. In 600 BC, a young wealthy man, on his gap year, to be known as Thales of Miletus, that is there's an E in there somewhere. That is in somewhere in modern day Turkey, visits Egypt, hears of these myths, and his take home from that is that, or from hearing those creation myths, that water is the primary element from which all other things are created. Thales becomes one of the 7 sages of Greece, one of the considered wise men of Greece. He had followers. He had a lot of followers, actually. Created the school, the Miletus, I don't know how to pronounce it, Miletus school. It's a philosophical school. And members of that school, and I use these names just because I love these names, Anaximander thought air was the primary element. Heraclitus, that's a U.S., thought fire was the essential primary element. Anaximenes came back to air. And finally, Empedocles. Empedocles was the last of the Milesian school. He thought it was earth being the primary element. And here's what he said, that the 4 of them were the roots. The roots of matter. These are the 4. We're finally at a term of element where we mean, the thing that makes up matter. He thought these were the roots of matter. They mix and they commingle in different ratios. And by mixing in different ratios, you get different bits of different identities of matter. The 4 are related by love, an attractive force, and by strife, a repellent force. For example, air and fire, they have a strife. But earth and water, they have love. Water will absorb into earth very nicely. But water and fire will put each other out. I guess air and fire, they have to have love. Water and fire, strife. Earth and water, love. Earth and air, strife. It was the beginnings of a theory of matter. So Empedocles, he is something around 500 BC. Next in the agenda is Plato, 400 BC. In a book, in his most popular book, Timaeus, his most popular at the time, he said two things. He said, first, there is a primary substance, prime matter. It has no properties on its own, but it can take on properties that are given to it. If you heat prime matter, it becomes fire. If you cool prime matter, and I don't know what conditions he proposed. He didn't propose conditions for these. You can get from prime matter, you can make fire and air and water and earth. And because all matter is the same material with different properties, it is possible to interconvert between one form of matter and another one. He gave some ideas that you could take earth and water, and from that grow a tree from which you harvest wood, and then if you set fire to the wood, you would end up with air, that would be the smoke that comes off, and earth would come back in the form of ashes. These are transmutations. That's the first thing he said. The second thing he said, and this is the thing that really did some damage. He said, there are two things you can know, or two states of existence. Being and becoming. Being has reached a state of perfection. Becoming has not, and it is in the process of becoming perfect. I guess I should use imperfect. And in his description of these, he put reason under being. He said anything that you can work out logically must be perfect. And anything you observe including observations and sensations, are to be distrusted because they are not perfect. You have no idea how much damage this idea did. He was followed by Aristotle. And Aristotle liked this idea. So he tried to reason everything out, and he went crazy, reasoning things out. By reason, he arrived at the conclusion that all horses have 24 teeth, and that flies should all have 8 legs. Well, look at flies, and they have no 8 legs. They got 6. And look at horses' mouths, and almost no horses have 24 teeth. They've all got something else. But because it was reasoned, this is what he believed. So Aristotle. So if we were to take Plato's description, of earth, air, fire, and water, Aristotle didn't like the idea that elements were transmutable. Or he didn't like the idea that the elements, that the prime matter had no properties of its own. But he liked the idea that you could by changing the state of something, you could transmute one element into another element. What he really liked were properties. He liked to define the properties of matter. And he said, instead of having earth and air, he would call it just hot. And water, let's see, do I have this right? I didn't. I fixed it. Fire and air at the top, earth and water at the bottom. He said fire and air share hotness. Water and earth share coldness. Fire and earth share dryness. And air and water share wetness. In Aristotle's view, we still have 4 elements. Only now, instead of being the thing we see, they are the properties that the elements possess. So he took a step away from the elements themselves and took it to properties. Change the properties of matter, and you can change one type of matter into another type of matter. I'm going to insert some things here. Wait, that's not hot. That's I've included the alchemical symbols that are going to be used to represent these, and you can see where they're coming from. I mean, they're almost physically coming from this kind of a diagram. Okay, so for Aristotle, it's all about properties, the properties that matter possesses. Now, I'll just, from a modern point of view, stand back and ask, is this reasonable? Is it really the case that if you add wetness to fire, that you end up with air? Well, it's really hard to justify that. You know, give me an example where wetness added to fire produces air. And the obvious one is you put fire under a pot of water and it boils away and it moves into the air. But the reverse process doesn't happen. You can't then just automatically turn the steam into liquid. Or you can't take a sample of air, just grab some air and turn it into a liquid just by cooling it down, by doing the opposite process, or by moving across to dryness. You could go one way, and maybe it looks that way, but you can't undo that property. It is as though matter, to this point of view, matter would have to have a memory of some kind and make sure that it doesn't go back to what it used to be. Anyway, there were problems with this. Now, the third part of this evil triangle, I'll call it, is Alexander the Great. When he was between the ages of 14 and 16, he was a pupil of Aristotle. You know, when your dad is the king and you want the teacher, you go out and find the best one you can get. And Aristotle was it. Alexander the Great learned Aristotle's ideas. And when Alexander the Great went out to conquer, let's see, so here is Egypt, North Africa, Iberian Peninsula, come up, Italy, sorry about that, Greek, Turkey, the Levant, comes over. Alexander the Great started conquering Greece. Didn't move very much farther over. He went around through the Levant. He went to Egypt. He went a little bit this way. And then his big turn, his dad had always regretted not conquering Persia. So Alexander the Great went and conquered Persia. So here's Turkey. And then he moved into Iran and Iraq. He just kept going. He went over into all of the stands. Pakistan, Uzbekistan, all those areas got conquered. And he kind of ended in Tibet. As he went through and conquered these areas, he wanted to have more of a permanent rule. And he knew that when he withdrew his armies, there would be local people who wanted to take over. So when he went through and conquered, he did not try to replace their government. He left it in place so that the people in power stayed in power as he came through. All he did was introduce all these ideas. The biggest idea that he introduced was the Koine Greek, the common Greek language, so that everybody could understand what everyone else was saying. So if you had in the marketplace something you wanted to sell, you could sell it in further places than just your locality. You could start trading between all these different groups. And this was a fairly stable sort of rule. He didn't charge taxes on everybody to take home to Rome. He figured he had enough money on his own. He also took Greek culture. In what we call the Hellenistic period. The Greek culture he took, well, guess what book he brought with him? Timaeus. And guess whose philosophies were taught in the schools in these different places? It was Aristotle. So this idea that matter was made of 4 elements was being taught to everybody. And it's just good enough an idea, I guess, that it caught on with everybody and nobody really challenged it because it seemed so harmless at the time. But if you want to see where it went, look at what happened in medicine. People were trying to find causes for illness. I mean, it's a natural thing to do. When somebody gets ill, you want to know why they got ill. And one of the earliest ideas was that you somehow had not elements, but things inside you that got out of balance. And by 100 AD, Galen had taken this idea and he decided the only way to really sort out what all is going on inside is to look at the fluids. And if you look at the fluids not super carefully, but if you look at the fluids just in a general way, you can sort it down to 4. And the 4 are blood, black bile, phlegm, and yellow bile. Yellow bile, urine, black bile, feces, phlegm, mucus, and blood is blood. And by administering concoctions or plants or food, or by opening the skin and letting some blood come out, you could change the balance of these humors. You could change the balance and get back to this perfect spot, right in the middle where everything is perfectly balanced. Now, this is not a new idea with Galen. This idea was at the time 300 years old because that's exactly what Aristotle had said. If you balance dry and wet and cold and hot just right, you end up here in the middle, and guess what's there? There's gold. So Galen was simply taking Aristotle's idea of balance, of these four properties. Before Galen, there were like 9 different humors known, but Galen simplified it. And for the next 1,600 years, no, 1,500 years after Galen, this is the only medical theory taught. Any kind of advances in medicine simply stopped at this point. All the advances in understanding the elements stopped when Aristotle started saying what he said. They were attractive enough, and they were widespread enough because Alexander had taken this idea everywhere. And if everybody believes this idea, no one really challenges it. So I don't know what the total consequence to humanity is or was during this time, but at least the medical consequences were really severe. Many, many people died that didn't have to. Because with this idea, just kind of killing all other ideas, a lot of people who could have come up with better treatments, with more causative treatments, like you're getting sick not because your yellow bile is too high, you're getting sick because you're drinking really bad water. Stop drinking really bad water, let's find better water for everybody. Kind of ideas. Could have kept a lot of people alive. At about 100 AD, a bunch of other things started getting together. The first is in the Nile Delta. Alexandria was born. It's named after Alexander the Great. And the kings of Egypt at the time, the Ptolemies, funded libraries, amongst a lot of other things. They had lots of money and they funded libraries. Alexandria became a real important place. Almost all the important Greek books were collected into Alexandria. And we've got stories of the Alexandrian librarians trying some little tricky stuff so they could have the best copy of everything. For example, they would hear that somebody had a book, and they would send messengers and say, we would like to borrow your book so that we can make a copy of it for the libraries. There were many libraries. It wasn't just Alexandria. There were several in Alexandria. There were some in islands off the coast. There were some scattered around through the Levant area. That would be Palestine, Israel, Syria. So the person who had that book would let it go, let it be taken back to Alexandria. Copies were made, and a copy was delivered back to the owner. Well, the owner didn't like that idea, but you couldn't hardly do much about it. So they would collect these originals and make copies of them as best they could. And if you want to know what a copy looks like, try making one. Find a chapter of a book and copy that chapter, and then electronically compare your copy with the original and see how many mistakes you made. Mistakes happen all the time. So the more original you have, the more accurate version you probably possess. Okay, so 100 AD. A lot of important ideas came together in Alexandria. And when I say Alexandria, I mean areas under Alexandria's influence, which would be places in Turkey as well as Egypt and Alexandria itself. We had Gnostic Christianity. Gnosticism is based on the idea that there is secret knowledge. It's a mystic kind of an idea. That there's secret knowledge that you can possess. And if you possess that secret knowledge, then the distance between you and heaven is much shorter than it would be otherwise. Generally, mysticism became a bigger thing. Now, I don't know how mysticism got into alchemy, but it certainly did, and it probably wasn't through the Gnostics. And then the four-element theory was involved. Alchemy, or alchemists, called natural philosophers primarily, if they were to write, or of the records we have, before alchemy went into the Arabic culture, the references we have are philosophers. They called themselves philosophers. These three things combined, and alchemy was born. Alchemy is the belief that, just like Aristotle said, if you change the properties of a piece of matter, you can modify it, you can move it around, and that diagram. That diagram of Aristotle's, whoops, that should have been hot up there. This diagram was the instructions for moving things around. If you could identify where in that square a particular kind of matter was, matter that you had in your hand, for example, a piece of silver. Silver, you could be, if gold was in the center, that's the symbol for the sun, it represents gold, then silver was nearby. And I don't know where it would be. I'll change the color here so you can see it. The moon represented silver. Silver was nearby. And if you could identify where in the vicinity of gold silver lay, you would know what kind of processes to do to silver. If it's in this place, I would need to add wet and hot. I would need to find a way to put wet and hot into that piece of silver so that it would end up gold. Well, it won't work. It just won't work. But what they did was it kind of bifurcated alchemy into two parts. The honest alchemists were sincere. They sincerely thought they understood matter and they were doing things the right way. And the dishonest alchemists simply wanted to understand the reactions so that they could make things look like gold. And we have some very important, very early papyri. They're named after where they are stored now, not where they came from. The Stockholm Papyrus is a really important one. It's a list of instructions how to fake the gold color. Recipes. They'll say exactly where to get your ingredients. Get some alum from Syria, because Syria's alum had whatever properties were needed to make this reaction go. If you got alum from someplace else, it didn't work. So recipes were known here. But the honest ones, these are the philosophers. These came to be known as the charlatans. The honest alchemists were sincerely trying to turn lead or silver into gold, or lead into gold, or any other metal that they could make easily, turn that into gold. At this point, there are even more differentiations of alchemy. There is a form of alchemy that developed in India and Tibet. It is still practiced today. But the goal of the Indian and Tibetan alchemies was longevity. How to extend your life. How to make your later years more enjoyable through alchemy. There was also a Chinese alchemy, and that was also primarily devoted to longevity, although some suspect that gunpowder manufacture came out of alchemy labs. And these two alchemies didn't change very much. Go to a back market in China or India or Tibet, and you can ask for nostrums that will make your digestion improve, or something that might give you health or better sleep. These are all coming back from the alchemical theories. Well, nothing much happened. I mean, we've got some really good stories that we're being told. These honest alchemists had this belief that what they were doing was, in a very important way, mimicking God's work. They weren't really religious people, but they had a phrase, and it is put in the words of Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes. This is the god Hermes. And this is somebody who knew Noah and knew Moses. And he was thrice magnificent because he was the expert in alchemy, astrology, and natural magic. So Hermes, thrice magnificent, was an expert in knowing. Well, I got to go back to Aristotle to do this. One of Aristotle's reasoned out ideas was that the earth had to be the center of the universe. Because the earth, rocks, and dirt have a natural motion, and that is down. And water also has a natural motion that is down. So the earth would be surrounded by water. And around the water, you would find air. And at the very top of the air, you should find a layer of fire. Fire goes up through the air. It established a natural axis, starting from the center of the earth outward. Whoops. That's become known as axis mundi, the axis of the world. And if you extend beyond the sphere of fire, you move into the crystal spheres, the perfect, transparent crystal spheres. In one of them, there is the moon. And in another one, there is the sun. And in others, there are the stars, and they all rotate. Their natural motion is around. So they all rotate naturally. You don't have to impel them and keep them going. They just rotate by themselves. And astrology was the idea that this axis, this sphere of the stars, as it rotated around, would influence the sun rotation, and that would influence the moon's rotation, and that would influence the fire and the air and the water and finally the earth. The entire globe is influenced by the rotation of those stars because they are the outermost sphere, and outside that is God. And God directs the operation of the earth by rotating the stars and causing comets to appear. Other kinds of odd behaviors, for example, somewhere up here is the Mars sphere, and occasionally the Mars planet appears to go backwards on itself, and then it keeps going forward again. God is directing that, and by that direction he is influencing us. That's what astrology is. It's an old Aristotelian idea. Natural magic, that's just an understanding of plants and minerals. How you can use plants to make yourself more healthy. So natural magic went into the Greek and the Chinese and Indian types of alchemy in a really big way. All right. So alchemy was practiced until about 600 AD. And it didn't peter out, but the funding of the Ptolemies did. The Ptolemies stopped putting so much money into the libraries. And when that happened, people wouldn't go to the library anymore. The librarians saw their income drop. And if you're a good librarian and you love books and your library is about to just close up, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to find the very best books and take them home with you. So the libraries dispersed. And about 700 AD, inaugurated the golden age of Islam. Islamic scholars were, the religion of Islam spread very rapidly. It spread through Iran and Iraq. It moved into the Levant. It moved into Egypt. It moved through North Africa. And scholars of Islam were finding these old books written in Koine Greek. And they were translating them into Arabic. And they were learning everything that Plato and Aristotle had said. And a lot of these books were not known among people in Greece and Rome. These were books that had been written and never become really popular, but they ended up in the library and they ended up in the hands of some of these Arabic translators. So these ideas, many of the ideas of Plato and Aristotle became known for the first time. And alchemists were kind of reborn from that. The Arabic alchemists started up, and this is probably when the term alchemist took on its name. Nobody's really sure of the origin of the word alchemist, but it does seem as though it's an Arabic word deriving from alchem, of the black. Black lands, that's how Egypt was known, or at least the Delta was known. They were known as the Black Lands because if you have a lot of really good water flowing over your lands every year, they become very rich in humus and they become dark. Very, very nutritious, very nutrient filled so that grains would grow well there. So maybe that's where it came from. There are other theories. Nobody really knows. Probably the greatest of the alchemists was Jabir. Jabir wanted to do alchemy right. And he wanted to be as kind of honest as you can be as an alchemist. So he would try to define things, especially in measurements. He tried to work out what the measurements of things ought to be. And he introduced the idea of degrees. For Jabir, there were 4 degrees. The first degree is the lowest. The second degree is 3 times whatever that was. The third degree was 5 times. And the fourth degree was 8 times. And I am still not sure. 8 times what? Is it 8 times this, or is it 8 times that? It's probably 8 times this 1 times. So 4th degree was 8 times as big as the coolest, or as the first degree. He applied it to fire. And it can't be 8 times 5 times 3 times 1 in terms of fire. He first used degrees in defining the flames of a furnace. So you do this process over a 1st degree flame, and you do this other process over a 3rd degree flame. He also used degrees to try to define his axes. So I'll come back to he wasn't so much interested in the boundaries as he was in the intersections. And here's what Jabir said. He said, along this horizontal line, only metals will be found. And all metals are found on that horizontal line. It makes it easy to figure out where on that line a particular metal is. He still had gold right in the center. Everybody has always put gold at the most balanced part. If you can figure out where your starting metal is, if you're starting with lead, for example, lead might be down here. Jupiter. I think that's a symbol for Jupiter. Give me a second. I got to look this up in my alchemy book. I keep a set of notes that has as many of these things as I can get in it so that I can look it up when I need it. Yeah, that's good. Sorry, that's tin though. If you started with tin and you thought it was here, then you knew what you needed to do to the tin to get it over to where gold is. You needed to add wet. Now, what does wet mean in terms of a metal? Well, to Jabir, it meant mercury. Mercury, clearly the wettest of the metals. So mercury, it has a symbol. You needed to add mercury to the tin. And when you add mercury to the tin, it does seem to move a little bit over this way. What if you were on the other side? What if you had something, what if you did have lead over here? Its symbol, whoops, it's not quite the right kind of H. I need a really stylized H. If you had lead and you needed to make it dry, he used sulfur as the driest quote metal. Really wasn't very dry, but it had this symbol. If you could divine through measurements of degrees where on this line your metal sat, what you could do to add wetness to tin, for example, is to, using that same line, there's the center point, if tin is this far that way, what I'm going to do is make a second material that sits right there. If I can make them the same distance out from the center, I can cast this new metal onto tin, heat it up until they melt together, and then I've given the wetness property to the tin that should bring it back to gold. this is a really hot theory at the time. Everybody who studied matter loved this idea. When his name went over to Europe, it came over as Geber. And it took a long time for that to come over. So Geber, he's doing this about 800, Jabir, he's doing this about 800 AD, but it wasn't until the 1100s, late 1100s, when this came over to Europe. Well, it's pretty obvious why. At about this same time, the Europeans were involved in the Crusades. They were going back to Jerusalem to save Jerusalem from the infidels, from the Islamicists. And huge amounts of hatred developed from that. And so if you were in, most parts of Europe, Paris or Rome, you would not ever think of taking anything Arabic and translating it, because you would have thought it has no value whatever. But there was a community that did take things from Arab, and that was Spain. There was a fairly significant migration of northern African Berbers from the coast of North Africa over to the Iberian Peninsula. It's not a very long boat ride. So Berbers were starting to settle in Spain. And the Spanish, who were now living among the Berbers, found the Berbers were quite reasonable, nice people. They're still there. They became known in Spain as the Moors. These were the Berbers. And they brought with them some Arabic ideas. And they brought with them some of the Arabic books. And among them were the books by Jabir and some of the other alchemists. By the way, Jabir, these were probably people working in what is now Iran. They were working in Persia. But their ideas were spreading around. They were certainly spreading into Africa, where the other concentration of alchemists were, still gathered around Alexandria. They were translating all the books. So when the Moorish translations happened, that's where they found out, that's where the Europeans started hearing about Aristotle and Plato as being great men and great men of ideas. By about 1190, most of the books had come over and been translated, and people in Europe were beginning to read these Arabic texts. And when they did, they realized, wow, Aristotle is just full of ideas. I look back on it, yeah, Aristotle is just full of it. But they thought they were good ideas. And a few years later, early 1200s, at the University of Paris, two very particular men showed up. One was Roger Bacon, and the other Albertus, I just forgot his last name. Albertus Magnus. Albertus Magnus was a self-centered blowhard under anybody's calculation. And he entered the campus dressed in robes, announcing himself as the new Aristotle. He just thought he was the bee's knees in thinking. Roger Bacon was pissed off because Roger Bacon was the classics professor. He is the guy who taught Aristotle. They were both alchemists, and they both hated each other's guts. Albertus Magnus. Okay, here's the story. Jabir said in one of his books, you cannot transmute the elements. Period. No qualification on that. You can't do it. Somebody had stuck this paragraph, and it's a very short paragraph, onto the bottom of Aristotle's book, Meteorology. So meteorology, you're going through all this book, and then finally you get to this last paragraph, you cannot transmute the elements. Albertus Magnus read this and thought it was Aristotle who said it. Now, for a guy who thinks of himself as a new Aristotle, you think, oh, I will believe Aristotle. No, he didn't. What Magnus said, that there was missing a part at the end. Except if you start with pure elements. Jabir almost fixed alchemy, and Magnus made sure it didn't work. All right, so Albertus Magnus, Roger Bacon, wrote books on alchemy, became popular throughout Europe. Some of the earlier writings started becoming popular. Alchemists were all about turning lead into gold, or turning some easily obtained base metal into gold using Jabir's method, using Jabir's techniques. Figuring out where you were, finding kind of an antidote material that when mixed with the metal that you have will turn it into gold. And of course it didn't work. And it kept not working until the mid-1650s. I got to pause here because I got to find a name. The name is Petrus Ramus. He's probably the very first guy who started questioning Aristotle. He did it well enough that he wrote a book, and the title of that book was "Everything That Aristotle Said Is Wrong." Not that obviously. He kind of hid the meaning of the title of his book. Go look it up. But in its meaning, it meant everything that Aristotle said was wrong. And that's true. Everything that Aristotle said was wrong. And it took a long time for people to start believing it. But you can trace the descent of this throwing off Aristotle. Just so you know, about 400 AD, the Western Catholic Church adopted Aristotle as a diviner of doctrine. So Aristotle's universe, that was core belief of the Catholic Church. Everything Aristotle said was core belief of Catholic Church, and it really got strengthened in the 1200s when all these other texts from Aristotle and Plato showed up. So the church was Aristotelian. They believed in Aristotle's universe, and Galileo believed Petrus. By the way, Petrus was at the University of Paris. And he tried saying this. People from the church did not like him saying this, Because you can't say, one of the fundamental originators of your doctrine is wrong about everything he said. You can't really get away with that. So Petrus Ramus quit the Catholic Church, joined the Protestant religion, and eventually he was killed by Catholics as they were running around killing everybody who was a Protestant. Religious wars got bad back then. Galileo believed Petrus Ramus and threw off the ideas of Aristotle that said big things fall faster than small things. Something that Aristotle had reasoned out. Galileo went and measured it and discovered, no, they don't. So he could start to prove that Aristotle was wrong. Descartes, in mathematics, started to question Aristotle's mathematics and show that there was a mathematics far beyond anything that Aristotle had imagined, and you have to throw away some of Aristotle's ideas to get there. The one I'm going to talk about, and this is 100 years later, is Robert Boyle. Robert Boyle, very rich guy, hung out with other rich guys. He was young. Being young, that meant he had a lot of time on his hands. Being rich meant he could buy a lot of stuff that he wanted to play with and use. Robert Boyle was an alchemist. But he was an alchemist who was annoyed by alchemy. He said, one of the things that really cheeses me off is an alchemist who said, I will now explain the meaning and the methods of alchemy as if to my own son, in clear and concise language, and then doesn't do anything of that below his in the alchemist's writing. He did not like the idea that people didn't know what they were doing so that they could explain it in a single sentence. Robert Boyle and his drinking buddies were all dabblers in this alchemy, but they were also followers of Petrus Ramus. The idea, the things that we had heard in the past must always be the best. Ask anyone before 1650 who is the greatest person who ever lived. You would get two answers, Jesus Christ and Aristotle. And one of them lived 2,000 years earlier. So Robert Boyle was questioning that idea. And as an alchemist, he was doing experiments. And as he was doing experiments and talking with his friends about his results, he realized there were two things that weren't happening. People were not measuring things themselves. They were taking Aristotle's word for it, or somebody else they read, or their master. Now, this was a master-apprentice kind of a time. If you wanted to be an alchemist, you would apprentice yourself to an alchemist, and he would give you slowly his secrets, and you wouldn't tell anybody except your own pupil, your apprentice, you would tell. People would believe everything their master said. And Robert Boyle said, no, if you want to do natural philosophy, you've got to go measure things yourself. And so that implies stop believing what you hear. Don't trust it. Measure it yourself. He said those two things in the longest, most convoluted book ever written, which is, I don't know why he did this, because Robert Boyle could write well. He could write a concise, clear paper. And he wrote this book, The Skeptical Alchemist. That's just the start of the title. It's really quite long, the title is. He wrote this book as a dialogue, and it is the most confusing, confounding thing I have ever read. It's more confusing than anything I have ever written. it's just almost unreadable. It's so convoluted and complex and unclear. And I don't know if he wrote it that way as a joke, as an inside joke. No, I'm going to write this in the form that alchemists write things. Very unclear. I don't know. But if you can make it through The Skeptical Alchemist, you will find these two ideas. Stop believing what you hear and go measure it yourself. And he was measuring things. He's coming up with some of our first scientific laws. Just after he started publishing laws, Newton, also an alchemist, started making his own measurements and started to publish laws. Turns out anyone who made measurements could publish laws in those early days. It was Robert Boyle who started the end of alchemy, but it took another 100 years. It wasn't until in the 1790s that Antoine Lavoisier finally did away with alchemy by publishing a textbook of chemistry, showing the alternate. Instead of believing all the stuff that alchemists believed and trying to do what they did, here is what you really do. You make very, very careful measurements. Lavoisier was a tax collector and he got rich collecting taxes. Back then, the government itself did not collect taxes. They hired companies that went out and collected taxes and said, you can have this district of Paris. We figure there's this much money in taxes to be collected there. Go collect them. You can have the extra. Bring us that much money and you can have whatever's left over. Well, tax collectors got really rich and they were hated by everybody. And it wasn't very long before the French Revolution started up and Lavoisier was killed on the guillotine. His wife, who was his lab assistant and who was his his textbook illustrator, and she did a very good job. Still, you can look through his textbook and look at his figures and you know exactly what the equipment was that he was dealing with. No confusion anywhere. It's a beautiful textbook. She's the one who kind of popularized the textbook itself. Made it a big deal. Sent it to translators so that it can be published in other languages, especially English and German. It was originally written in French. And by the time of Lavoisier, it was pretty obvious that if you took anything from alchemy, made careful measurements, nothing was working or even close to it. So, Robert Boyle, probably the father of chemistry, Antoine Lavoisier, the first true chemist we had, get the credit for following Rames's idea to destroy everything of Aristotle's, and one of the big things that Aristotle left behind was alchemy. That's how I see the story. Now, there's a lot I left out, a lot I could have included. You got to take one of my classes or take someone else's class in alchemy if they teach it at your school, and find out what the fun of alchemy is. There is fun in alchemy, but I'll wait for you to find out what it is. So long, folks.